Welcome to my Learn to Knit video. This video is aimed at absolute beginners. Knitting is a wonderful craft. It only requires needles and yarn. And with those two items, you can create many wonderful objects. There are only two main stitches, the knit stitch and the purl stitch. If you can master just these two stitches, then you can work all sorts of knitting patterns. If you find this video helpful, please like and consider subscribing. Before you can get started, you will need yarn and you will need needles. Check out the description box below for the materials that I recommend, or continue watching. There are several types of knitting needles. There are straight needles, there are circular needles, and there are double-pointed needles. These are some examples of straight needles. This is an example of a circular needle. It has two needle tips and some form of cord in between. And this is an example of a double-pointed needle. There are tips at both ends. These usually come in sets of 5 or 6. Circular needles and double-pointed needles allow you to knit circularly or in the round. There are several types of needle materials: wood or bamboo, metal, and plastic. You can find others, but these are the main types. I recommend beginners start with wood needles because the stitches can grip along the needles. If, as you are knitting a little bit, and you find that your tension, what's called your tension, is too tight, or that the stitches are way too tight on the needle and you cannot slide them back and forth, consider switching to metal needles. These allow the stitches to slide much more freely. Don't be afraid to try different needle materials. Needles come in different sizes. Here in the US, we have what's called the US number system. This would be a size US 7. This is a 9. This is a 10. As the numbers increase, the size of the needle increases. Needles will also include the millimeter sizes. So a size 9 is 5.5 millimeters in diameter. A 7 is smaller and it is 4.5 millimeters in diameter. This is a size 3 needle and it is 3.25 millimeters. Needles can go from a quad 0 all the way up to a size 50. Ideally, you choose your needle size based on your yarn weight. For beginners, I recommend a wood or bamboo needle in size 8, 9, or 10. Yarn comes in many different weights. That is a measure of how thick the yarn is. For beginners, I recommend a worsted weight yarn. This is a worsted weight yarn. You will find the word worsted, or you want to look for this symbol on the yarn band. A number 4 medium weight yarn is a worsted weight yarn. This thickness of yarn will work well with our US size 8, 9, or 10 needles. Other yarn weights are sock weight yarn or fingering, which is slightly thinner, and lace weight yarn, which is even finer. And there are many other weights, up to super bulky and cobweb lace yarn. You can find these symbols at Craft Yarn Council, and it gives a recommended needle size for each weight and a typical gauge, which is the number of stitches that you can produce in an inch with that particular yarn. There are many different fiber types as well. Wool or wool blends are the most common, and that is what I recommend for beginners. Wool is easier on the hands and produces a very nice fabric. Cotton is also very prevalent, but I don't recommend it for beginners because it can be hard on the hands and a little bit more difficult to work with. The finished fabric for beginners may not be satisfactory. You can also find acrylic yarns and other plant fibers such as cotton or linen. As you get more into knitting, feel free to explore the wide range of fibers that are out there. Yarn can come in what are called skeins or in balls. Balls are ready to knit with as they are. You will find the side and pull out the end. pull from the center of the ball. This is called a center pull ball. Skeins, like this, are a better way to store the yarn because the yarn is under less tension than it is balled up like this. But this will need to be wound into a ball before you can use it. You will need an umbrella swift and a ball winder. Most yarn shops, however, have these and will happily wind your yarn for you. So now we're ready to get knitting. All you need are your hands, your needles, and your yarn. Let's go. First, we need to make a slip knot. Leave at least a 6-inch tail. Like so. And we will place it on a needle. Ignore that tail for now. This is what's called the working yarn, and it is attached to our ball of yarn. Now we will do what's called casting on. Knitting works from live loops off of one needle onto another needle. Therefore, we need to get our set of live loops onto this left-hand needle. It is important that you work from the left tip to the right tip. It doesn't matter if you're right-handed or left-handed. This is the process. We're casting on stitches to the left-hand needle. You will take your right-hand needle tip and insert it from below into that slip knot that's on the left-hand needle. Now, using the working yarn, not this tail, you come around that right-hand needle tip, and we're using the right-hand needle tip, pulling that loop through. Now we will loosely make our tips orient the same way, and we're going to place that loop onto the left-hand needle, like so. And we repeat that process until we have the correct number of loops on our needle. And whatever number that is, your pattern will tell you whatever number that is. For about a 6-inch wide scarf, you would cast on 30 stitches. This cast on is what is called the knitted cast on. And when we learn the knit stitch, you will see why. Remember, you are learning a new skill. It will take time and practice. Give yourself some grace and be patient. Don't worry about what your fabric looks like at this stage. Your goal is to learn what is happening between the needles and the yarn. Your fabric will look better as you get more used to the motions. It's better that this is too loose than too tight. So be relaxed. To count your loops, you count these loops that are on the needle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can drop the yarn, as I'm doing here. Or you can attempt to tension the yarn. But again, be careful not to work these too tightly. If you are left-handed, you can try tensioning the yarn. In your left hand. Like so. I have 20 stitches. I will stop there. If you would like a wider scarf, cast on 30 stitches. Now that we have our stitches cast on, we are ready to learn the knit stitch. The needle with the live stitches, these are live stitches, will be held in your left hand, whether or not you are a right or left-handed knitter. The empty needle will be held in your right hand. There are two main types of knitting methods, and these are basically how you hold the needles and the yarn. The English method I find is easier for right-handed knitters. The yarn is tensioned in the right hand, like so. What's called continental can be easier for left-handed knitters. The yarn is tensioned in the left hand. But still, the live stitches are in the left hand needle, the empty needle is in the right hand, and we are moving stitches from the left needle to the right needle. The difference is which hand is holding the yarn. There are other methods out there, and as you get used to what knitting entails, feel free to play around and try out some of the other knitting methods. There's different ways to hold the knitting needles. They could be held like pencils. Play around until you find something that feels comfortable for you. Keep in mind that right now as you are learning, it's likely to be uncomfortable until you get used to the motions. The knit stitch is very similar to what we just did with our cast on. You will insert the right hand needle tip into the loop, just like we did as we were casting on. And you will loop through and pull that loop up. Now, when we were casting on, we moved this loop onto the left needle. Now, we don't need to do that. What we do instead is we drop this loop from the left needle, and we've now moved that loop from the left needle to the right needle. and made a new stitch. We continue and then drop. In, around, through, and drop. In, round, through, and drop. Now if you want to try holding your yarn in your left hand, you will do what's called picking. This is continental. You're still going in. This time you're going around, through, and drop. In, around, through, and drop. In, around, through, and drop. It is important that the yarn goes around this way because we don't want to end up with what are called twisted stitches. The leading leg of the stitch should be in the front. And wrapping the yarn around like that produces that. If we wrapped it the other way, like so, our leading leg is in back, and we don't want that. We want the leading leg in front. If you end up with twisted stitches though, don't worry about it. Our key right now is to make sure we have the right number of loops on our needle and that we don't drop any of the ones from the left until we've worked them. When you are done, count your stitches and make sure you have the same number that you started with. We are knitting flat, so with flat knitting you will turn this needle around and it now becomes the left hand needle. We take the empty needle and put it in our right hand. Now we're back to where our tail is, so make sure you don't start knitting with that. Make sure your working yarn is here below this needle and not looped over it. That will add a stitch here at the end of the row and we don't want that. So the working yarn should be down below and we will do the same motions. We will knit again across. Work as many rows in a knit stitch as you need to feel very comfortable making a knit stitch. Again, at the end of every row, count your stitches and make sure you have the same number. When you're knitting flat and you knit every row, you're producing a fabric called garter stitch. Garter stitch ends up looking like this with ridges, and here it is vertically right here. Now that you're comfortable with the knit stitch, let's learn the purl stitch. The purl stitch is the exact opposite stitch from the knit stitch. What that means is our knit stitch was worked by inserting the needle from the front to the back. The purl stitch is worked by inserting the needle from the back to the front. So the way we work this is this leading leg right here. We come from right to left, and then the yarn goes around like so, and we pull that loop to the back and then drop the stitch from the left needle. I'm using my left hand to move the yarn so that my hand stays out of the camera. I would normally use my right hand. My normal method, it looks like this. But it is going around in between those needles from over top, and then you pull it through to the back, and then you drop the stitch from the left. So again, it comes from right to left, around over top, pull through to the back, drop from the left hand needle. Like so. Again, count your stitches. Make sure you have the same number that you started with. Make sure you pull the working yarn to the front before you insert the needle tip, because otherwise you can end up with this. So I've left the yarn to the back. Now I pull up, and I actually have added what's called a yarn over. I've added an extra stitch here at the end of this row. I have 2 loops when I started with 1, and that is because I didn't pull the yarn forward first and then work my purl stitch. So work several rows in the purl stitch to get used to the purl stitch. Next, we'll combine the knit stitch and the purl stitch. Combinations of knit stitches and purl stitches are where knitting gets interesting. Let's work a common ribbing pattern, which is a knit to purl to pattern. we will begin by knitting 2 stitches. Knit 1, knit 2. Now we want to purl 2 stitches. To do that, first we have to move the yarn forward from between the needles underneath. Just like when we began a new purl row, the yarn needs to be forward. To purl, the yarn needs to be forward. Then we can purl 2 stitches. Now, to knit, the yarn needs to, again, then move to the back. And we can knit 2. Once more, the yarn comes forward, in between the needles, underneath. Now we can purl 2. And then the yarn moves to the back. Let me show you if you were holding the yarn in your left hand. You will knit 1, knit 2. The yarn comes forward and you will purl 1 and purl 2. The yarn goes to the back and you will knit 2. If you did not pull the yarn forward in between the needles before you purled and you moved the yarn from the back over and then you purled, you would again be adding a stitch. This is called a yarn over. You would be, and it's an increase, you would be adding an extra stitch, and we don't want that. So we bring the yarn forward in between the needles and purl the last 2 stitches. Again, count your stitches at the end of every row to make sure you have the same number of stitches as you started with. Don't worry about what your fabric looks like. Your goal is to consistently maintain the same number of stitches, to not accidentally add or subtract stitches from your needle. Ideally, finish a whole row before you set your work down. To continue the ribbing pattern, you will continue the knit 2, purl 2 pattern. These stitches are knit stitches, and these stitches with the bumps are purl stitches. If you've cast on 20 stitches, then you should be able to begin each row with a knit 2. If you've set your knitting down while you were in the middle of a row, when you pick your knitting back up, look for where the working yarn is, and it should be attached to the right hand needle. If you've accidentally picked it up and you begin working here, you will have done what's called a short row. You've added an extra row and you will find a hole in your knitting. So instead, always look for that working yarn to be attached to the right hand needle. And I'm on a pattern row of this ribbing. I can see I just worked 2 knit stitches. Here is a purl stitch. So I need to bring the yarn forward and purl that stitch. and purl this stitch. So as you get more fabric on your needle, begin to try to read your knitting and see what stitches are present from the row before. Another tip, when you set your knitting down and pick it back up, make sure the yarn is back behind and again not over the needle. This will add another stitch and you don't want that. Sometimes if you're very tense and you're working tightly, this last stitch can be pulled tight and look like 2 stitches. Make sure you pull your knitting down so that you, at the end of your row, you don't accidentally add an extra stitch. So play around with the knit stitches and the purl stitches. Keep working to get used to making the knit stitch and making the purl stitch and combining the two, and get used to reading your knitting and maintaining the correct stitch count. As you get more fabric on the needles and you become more comfortable, play around with how you hold the needles and how you hold the yarn. Hopefully you will find that your fabric begins to look more even as you get more used to the motions. When you're done with your project, you're happy with the length, and you're ready to cast on a new one, first we need to do what's called binding off. These are live loops. We cannot just take them off the needle, the whole work will unravel. There are many different ways to bind off, but the standard bind off is very simple. We will do what's called binding off in pattern, since I have ribbing stitches on the needle right here. All that means is you knit the knit stitches and you purl the purl stitches while you're binding off. To start, we work the first 2 stitches like normal. They were 2 knit stitches, so I will knit those 2 stitches. Then we take the left hand needle tip and we take the first stitch and we lift it over that second stitch and off the right hand needle. We've now bound off 1 stitch. Now I'm bringing the yarn forward so I can purl this stitch, and then again the left hand needle tip brings that first stitch over the second stitch, and so on all the way across our stitches. And you want to do this loosely, not too tightly. Then you will need a pair of scissors. And again, leaving a 6-inch or so tail, you will cut your working yarn. This last live loop that is on your right hand needle, thread that cut tail through that loop and pull. Not too tight. And you have now bound off your knitting at the top. So that was from start to finish, how to knit for beginners. I hope this was helpful. Knitting is such an enjoyable craft, and it's a craft that I love. If you use this video to learn to knit, please let me know in the comments. Don't give up. Keep practicing. It will become easier with time, and I can't wait to see the projects that you create. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and happy knitting.